But the child would always be given over to the father, to be laid in his lap as a sense of ownership, as a sense of, this is your child, this is what you own. This is the heir. Remember, it was a male child. This is the heir that is going to take over your inheritance. And yet in this story, it says that the child is laid in Naomi's lap, and something shifts, and something happens in this story. The other interesting thing about this story is that later on, if you carry on with the history of this story, is that you find that once Boaz is out of the picture, Ruth and Naomi get together. If you don't know the scripture, I want to really encourage you to go back and read this whole story, because it's a beautiful story of love. And in the Ruth and Naomi story, it's that you find that eventually when Boaz is out of the picture, and traditionally within their culture, they would have had to have taken on another man would have to have taken over care of them. But they've decided not to have another man in their lives for one reason or another. And in this story, they go on to make some public vows with each other. Ruth says to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Where I die, you will die. And where I'm buried, so will you be buried. May your God be my God. And may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds very familiar. It sounds incredibly familiar for a minister who does weddings. For the vows that Ruth and Naomi took thousands of years ago are the vows that are now shared in most contemporary wedding ceremonies, where we share a commitment of love one for another. How incredible that this story should be missed in so many different ways, but the piece that I think that we have missed as L and G people is that there was a phase there was a moment in Ruth's life where she was assumed to be heterosexual. And there is a moment in Ruth's life where she is assumed to be lesbian. And yet, isn't there some truth in this story that there is a likelihood that there is some bisexuality going on in Ruth's life, and certainly possibly in Naomi's life? How many of us feel uncomfortable when we talk about the notion of bisexuality, or indeed about bi-spirit? And I'm going to get to that point just a little bit later in my sermon. But how many of us have been so conditioned to be on one end or other of the spectrum of what has become known as the Kinsey scale? How many of us have been in so many ways conditioned to choose one extreme or the other? And yet, isn't there something real about those of us who perhaps are getting a little bit mature and older in our age, that we suddenly find that perhaps those extremes are not quite so extreme as we possibly thought? And how many of us are waking up to the fact that we are perhaps sliding backwards and forwards on that Kinsey scale, or finding perhaps that what we once thought was not appealing has suddenly become perhaps appealing? Oh, you're very quiet this morning. I'm not getting as many amens as I usually do. Amen. I mean, first of all, what on earth is a preacher doing talking about sex from the pulpit? And what is a gay preacher doing talking about bisexuality from a pulpit? The truth is that if we are to be this radically inclusive community, then we need to have these types of discussions so that we can break down the barriers and the fears that so many of us have of what has been considered other. And to acknowledge that other is actually you and me, in fear of really transcending all that we possibly could be. So many times just recently I've been hearing, not only from members of our own congregation, but certainly from the younger generation, who seem to be so much more fluid about their sexuality and their sexual identity than ever I was able to be as a young adult. I was always told that you had to choose one side of the fence or the other. And of course, if you chose the other side of the fence, you were damned to hell. I don't think the church really knows how to deal with this new generation. This new generation that I believe is first found thousands of years ago in the stories of Ruth and Naomi and David and Jonathan. But the stories that we have so often held on to as ours, we now see this new possibility. Perhaps there was just this fluidity that we have never yet experienced, and yet this new generation of youngsters that are coming up amongst us are finding so liberating. And I think some of it's rubbing off on us, as we are also finding our own fluidity of what it truly means to be created in the image of God that is both masculine and feminine and neither. That is truly the yin and yang of us. That is truly that openness of a God who created us female and male. God created us. Isn't it exciting to think that we can recreate ourselves even at this age? Isn't it exciting to believe that we can truly find our wholeness and our liberation, and that we no longer need to be in the box even of our sexual identities and our sexual orientations? Isn't it truly liberating to feel that we could be open to the possibilities of what might be next for in our journeys? Because quite honestly, at 43, I don't think God has finished with me yet. Amen. I think God has new possibilities for me. And don't worry, Carlos. God is the God of such... Carlos says, I'm not worried. I know which way my bread's buttered. But God is so full of possibilities for us that we need to discover the fullness of who we are. And not only around our own gender identity or our sexual orientations, but also around this notion of by spirit. You know, when Reverend Pat said to me that this was to be the focus of worship today around by spirit, I suddenly had this new awareness, especially in this story of Ruth and Naomi, that when Ruth and Naomi exchanged their vows and said, may your God be my God, there was some by spirit going on here. There was an exchange of their faiths that enabled them to merge what they had once believed into being a belief that they were able to share. I know about you, but that was truly liberating for me. As I watch people in our own congregation explore spirituality and the bi-ness of their spirituality. Isn't it Cole who gets up here on Sundays and when she calls for the offering, quotes not only the Bible, but quotes from the Tao? Isn't it Reverend Sandy who often gets up to celebrate communion and says that she's a Christian and a Buddhist? Don't we have folks amongst us, one is Christian and the other is Jewish? Don't we have folks amongst us, one is Christian and the other is Muslim? And yet somehow they have been able to merge their lives together, and in this very bi-spiritual way have come to know that your God is my God and my God is your God.